Thank you. Yes, so I'm here to introduce Michelle and Natalia. So start with Michelle. Michelle is an associate professor of TESOL at the Hamline University in St. Paul, Minnesota. She's a former secondary English language teacher, and her career began in a newcomer high school. She now prepares EL teachers as well as general education teachers to meet the needs of linguistically diverse students. Benegas was the principal investigator of the English Learners in the Mainstream Project, which was a 1.5 million national professional development grant from the U.S. Department of Education Office of English Language Acquisition from 2016 to 2022. She is the co-author of the bestseller book, Teacher Leadership for School-Wide English Learning, which published back in 2020. And she's the co-creator of the School-Wide English Learning Professional Development Series for TESOL Education. Throughout her work and as a consultant throughout the country, Michelle promotes an uninterrupted language learning experience for multilingual learners through harnessing the expertise of EL teachers to serve as site-based experts and coaches to their general education colleagues. Michelle has prepared over 600 EL teacher leaders across the country, and her scholarly interests include EL teacher leadership, teacher leader identity, and systemic approaches to improving EL services. Now on to Natalia, who is the Director of Multilingual Learning for Rochester Public Schools. And prior to that, she taught high school ethnic studies and multilingual learners in Rochester, Minnesota. She's a duly licensed she is duly licensed in K through 12 ESL and reading and holds a master's degree in language acquisition and teaching. She advocates for multilingual and multicultural education and is part of the Facing Inequities and Racism in Education Racial Equity Advocates Program. She is also a trainer in cultural competency for Education Minnesota. She has been a member of several organizations that support teachers and students, such as Education Minnesota League of Latinx Educators, Employees of Color Resource Group, and Rochester Education Association for her district, and the Women's Issues Committees for the National Education Association. She is passionate about the liberation of marginalized students and works on important issues such as identity work, heritage speakers, and humanizing pedagogies in education. She's an active member of MiniTESOL and TESOL and was named Minnesota Teacher of the Year in August 2021. All right, Michelle and Natalia, take it away.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction. I think we've got one more announcement here on this. We'll be having a raffle for our book. Was that Mia or Morgan? Did you want to say something about that?
So sorry, I think that was out of order. Yeah, we're going to have a raffle at the end of the webinar. All of you are entered as registrants and attendees. So just stick around at the end and we'll announce that and let you know how we'll send that out to you. Go for it.
Great. Thank you. All right. Well, welcome everyone. It's so nice to see you. It's great to see that people are from all over the place. I noticed we've got somebody joining us from the Philippines, and right now I'm in Bahrain in the Middle East, and it's 1 o'clock in the morning. So I'm rallying in order to be here with all of you. So we're thrilled to present our new book. Natalia and I have been dreaming this book up for a couple of years. The title is LILA. The acronym stands for Language of Identity, Language of Access. And then the rest of the title is Liberatory Learning for the Multilingual Classroom. So I'll just give you kind of an overview of the table of contents, and then Natalia and I will each present different pieces of the book and some of the kind of, the foundations and some examples of what you might see. And as was shared previously, we'll have a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions and you want to go ahead and put them in the chat, you can, and we'll just hold on to them until the end. All right, so part A, the beginning of the book, is kind of presenting the approach, the liberatory approach to language and literacy in the classroom. So kind of moving us away from this binary thinking about you either need to be attending to academic language or you need to be attending to home language development. Part B presents the language of identity and practical applications of theory. You'll see practical applications of theory throughout this book, and we'll be talking with you a little bit more about what that means soon. And then we have the language of access and practical applications of theory for the language of access. And then we'll close with kind of putting it all together and some tools that you can use in order to put LILA to action in your classroom. All right, so I want to start with just kind of an important moment that I would say was the seed for this book. In 2020, shortly after the pandemic started, George Floyd was killed in the state where Natalia and I live. And a lot around that time, there was a lot of talk about, how might we be in all of the different facets of society? How might we be participating in white supremacy? There was a statement that was put out by the College on Conference Compositions and Communications Special Committee on composing a statement on anti-Black racism and Black linguistic justice. And they said, we demand that teachers and researchers acknowledge that socially constructed terms such as academic language and standard English are false and entrenched in notions of white supremacy and whiteness that contribute to anti-Black linguistic racism. And that was a hard one for me to swallow. In fact, it called me and it called our profession to the table. It was a bit of a reckoning where a lot of folks were saying, but isn't academic language what we've been doing all along? What is it a problem to be, talking about academic language? How might the entire concept of academic language be a gatekeeping tool? So it was a really important, I think, pivotal moment for a lot of people. And there were some good discussions happening amongst educators and scholars in the field about, how can we make sure that we land on the right side of history? So what I think was the most exciting debate of all was the one between Jim Cummins and Nelson Flores. I think we've got some seasoned educators in the room, so these are probably names that you're familiar with. But Jim Cummins is responsible for BICS and CALP, so kind of talking about some of the differences between academic language and more kind of interpersonal language. Nelson Flores is an up-and-coming scholar in racial linguistics, and these two had a cordial back and forth about how they see language and race and power. It was really I think exciting to see that happen. If you want to learn more about that, I would check out Nelson Flores's blog. He has a blog where that kind of conversation has been going, and I think it's kind of died down since then. But at the time, these two were really debating what I thought were some big questions in our field and doing a lovely job of it. So we present what we call the polarized commitments or the competing commitments of an EL teacher or an ESL teacher, depending on where you are in the country. Commitment number one is that EL teachers acknowledge that academic English is a form of social capital, and it is their responsibility to provide students with this tool for social mobility. So we have our jobs to make sure that we're giving students the tools that they need in order to get into the college they want to go to, get the job that they want to have, pass chemistry class, whatever it might be. We know that we need to give them those linguistic tools to be successful. Commitment number two is ESL teachers acknowledge the importance of validating and valuing home languages and dialects and welcoming them into academic spaces. So commitment number two tends to fall in more of a bilingual education, trans-language in camp. And what we've seen in the literature is that these are two separate groups they're separate conversations sometimes. In fact, you have the commitment one folks saying, no, we have to do only English. We have to focus on English. And we see the commitment two folks saying, well, you're focusing too much on English and we're losing home language. And they're both right. At the end of the day, this really isn't an argument. And when Natalia and I discussed this, we said, yeah, these might seem like competing commitments, but they're both the commitments of an English language teacher. And that's what our book seeks to do, is to present these two perspectives in tandem. What I think is super interesting is that the research world thinks that this is radical, thinks that, that these two conversations don't tend to happen together. But teachers don't. Teachers say, of course, we believe this. We do these two things. We believe these two things. So I think in so many ways, I feel this way as a professor, that it just takes us a long time to put out the reality of what teachers are seeing and doing every day. All right. So defining some terms, that was you, Natalia. Go ahead.
I'll start with this. So the part B of the book, after the introduction, starts with the language of identity and criticality. And this is deeply personal for me. As a multilingual speaker and as a mother of bilingual children, linguistically sustaining instruction is at the heart of everything I do. And one of the reasons why I actually joined public education. I have seen my own children, right, struggle trying to figure out who they are. How do I make sense of myself, all my languages, all of those pieces. And so I wanted to be able to contribute to spaces where multilingual speakers, and specifically our young people, could have a space where they could develop that pride and that self-confidence to know that, yes, all of your languages are great. You don't need to turn one off and just focus on English, which is what happens often when our students are thrown right into monolingual English-only spaces. And so as I tried to learn more and figure out how could I do that in practice in a classroom, then I started researching a lot of the work that has been done into cultural linguistically sustaining education. And what does that look like, right? To be able to provide a space for students to develop their English skills and at the same time, not only sustain their languages, but find value in the language, not only that they speak, but maybe their communities. And so really that's what we focus on that part of it. And we'll have more details on this. Do you want to do language of access, Michelle?
Sure. You will notice that we kind of toggle and take these roles. That said, we both espouse both of these. And we are both parenting Spanish and English speaking kids. So the language of access is the second category here. And the language of access is linguistically expanding instruction. So if we think about the task being to sustain language and expand language. So we acknowledge that English is a form of social capital, and it is our responsibility to provide students with this tool for social mobility.
All right, so we're going to dive a little bit deeper into language of identity and criticality. I'll start with the language of identity. If this is one of the first times you've heard about this, you would notice that some of the researchers that are on this slide, Dr. Ofelia Garcia, who is a trailblazer for translanguaging, and then Dr. España and Dr. Herrera wrote a book, En Comunidad, and they really focus on this idea that as we support, right, our students' bilingual identities and their socio-emotional development, we're actually helping students, right, so that they can see themselves, they can have those connections in the classroom, but also that who they are is not anything less than anybody else. We can value all of their practices, and that's at the core of the identity work in the classroom, not only to bring mirrors in the classroom, but really to be able to affirm and elevate the practices that these students have, sometimes at home, their communities, and so forth. And the next one, the language of criticality. And Dr. Gloria Latson-Billings, who wrote about culturally relevant pedagogies, and Dr. Goldie Mohammed, if you've read her work as well, talk about the importance of criticality as well in the work. It's, of course, important to affirm our students, to find mirrors that they can learn from and feel pride in themselves and their cultures, but then really thinking of being able to show students what are some other things that are going on in their own context, whether that's local in their classroom and schools or in their communities. One quote that from Goldie Mohammed in her latest book that I love is when she talks about joy, right? We're not able to really feel joy when we are living in oppressive systems. And when we think of language and how language can be used to either elevate other languages or to oppress other languages, that's very important as far as that self-identity, so that our students don't internalize sometimes unconscious message that they get when they're in English-only spaces. And so being able to provide our students with an understanding of how power, right, oppression, equity, and all of these things show up in the different settings, right, where they are, is their lived experiences every day. Being able to have a space where they can talk about those things, where they are able to express how they feel when their languages are not necessarily affirmed, is important. And so you'll notice that through the book, we explore different frameworks that can be used in the classroom so that students can have language to name their experiences and to be able to sort of like pull the curtain and be like, oh, okay, now I understand why I had this experience. Now I have the words and the language to name what's happening to me. And now I can do work to find solutions, to be able to advocate for myself, to be able to advocate for my language communities, and to be able to find a way to be an agent of change, right? To be able to be a positive impact in their communities. So there's a couple of terms that we use throughout the book. One is translanguaging. And so just to have a definition is really thinking of our students being able to use their full linguistic repertoire. So not be able to only think in English, only in their other language, but being aware that all of the languages are present in a multilingual speaker and that they can be used for learning and also to affirm their identities. And then racial linguistics is, right, the notion that how a person interacts with others is not based just only on their language skills, but also on everything else that affects how they are perceived on their language. And that's part of the race, right? As somebody that looks like a Latina woman, my English is also being judged because of how I sound and how I look, and all of these intersect in the experiences of multilingual speakers.
All right, the next term that I want to introduce is academic language. That's a term that Nelson Flores has also critiqued and has said, but what does it mean? And people say, well, it's school talk. But what does it mean that there's a certain language that's used in one building and not in another building? Well, we've struggled to define what academic language means. So I'm going to take you on just kind of a walk through over the last 20 years or so about how we have defined the term. In 2002, Dutron Moran said that academic language is the language of school, literacy, content, and higher learning. In 2007, Jeff Zweers said academic language is the set of words, grammar, and discourse strategies used to describe complex ideas, higher order thinking processes, and abstract concepts. Then Snow and Uccelli in 2008 said, despite the frequent invocations of academic language and the widespread concern about its inadequate development, there is no simple definition of what academic language is. In 2010, Vogt, Echevarria, and Short, and those are the folks behind SciOp, said academic language differs considerably from the social conversational language that is used on the playground, at home, or at cocktail parties. Academic language is essential for success in school. In 2019, we hear from Nelson Flores saying academic language is a racial-linguistic ideology that frames racialized students as linguistically deficient and in need of remediation. And in 2020, Ofelia Garcia says academic language reinforces the power of the white monolingual middle class while failing Latinx bilinguals by positioning them as in constant need of linguistic remediation. So I'm very interested in language evolution, how we can take a term and it can change meaning to us over time. And so I think it's really interesting for us to take a look at this term and see how has it meant different things to different people over time and embrace the time that we're in right now. So this is how we landed on the term language of access. So I'll give you a definition for language of access. At best, the term academic is an apolitical term that has taken on an exclusionary tone over time. At worst, it's a gatekeeping term, referring to an academy that is entrenched in white supremacy and patriarchy. For this reason, instead of using the term academic language, we refer to language that is outside of a student's existing language repertoire as the language of access. When it comes to the language of access, the role of teachers is to open as many doors as possible for students and to teach them how to open doors for themselves. So we're doing away with this binary of, there's the cognitive language that you use at school, and there's the basic language that you use at home, walking away from that, binary, and rather just saying any language that you don't already have that you need in order to access other spaces. And those spaces might be college, they might be chemistry class. It also, might be skateboarding or surfing or, auto mechanic, any variety of spaces. I went to visit my daughters in their college dorm and I don't know what they're talking about. I don't have access to that language. So it's the language outside of our linguistic repertoire. So isn't that just academic language under a new name? And maybe it is, but I think what's really important for us is that we're bringing criticality to the forefront. We're listening to folks who have been harmed by this concept, and trying to do better.
And I will add just one more thing to that, because I was recently doing some professional development we have to do here for our literacy work at school. And it was super interesting to see how the academic language was framed, right, as a language that appears in research, in academia, right, in school settings. It referred a lot to, for example, college settings and that kind of setting. And I kept thinking, but there's so much even technical language or other language that cultures and families have that is rich and just beautiful. And when we determine academic language just as, right, the language of school, whatever setting that is, we are leaving outside all of this other language that is needed in different contexts. If I go to get my car fixed, there's a lot of language that I don't have access to. And so everybody has their own goals and journeys into what they want to be able to access. And I love reframing that because it becomes personal about the goals and the aspirations of every individual and how to support them in being able to access those.
Thank you, Natalia. I also want to throw out a question that I bet everyone in this Zoom room has gotten, and it's how do you do that if you don't speak all of those languages? And the response to that is our job is to teach the language of access, right? We are masters at understanding how the English language works, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. But our job is to support home language, to show our students that home language belongs in a classroom, that it is appropriate at school, that it is smart to use home language and a home language variety. So my job would never be to teach Vietnamese or to teach Somali, for example. Rather, my job is to create spaces where reading, writing, listening, and hearing those languages and varieties are welcome. All right, so let's get into the nitty gritty. This is a kind of a repackaging of bricks and mortar, if you're familiar with that paradigm. We've expanded the bricks and mortar paradigm to bricks, mortar, and buildings, and aligned it with the dimensions or the levels of language. So if we think about the word level, that would be bricks. So these are words or phrases specific to the content. And the three elements of language that fit within the word level are phonology, so how words sound. What's the difference between 1/10 and 1/10? Quite a bit. Morphology, parts of word, so understanding, like what does anti mean when it comes at the beginning of a word, and semantics, and that's word or phrase meaning, so vocabulary. You see some examples there of brick words, and what we tend to see the most is that when people are embracing language instruction, academic language, language of access, they start with vocabulary, which is awesome. And it's not everything. So there's a lot more to it than vocabulary. The next level here is the sentence level, otherwise known as mortar. So this is the general utility language used for constructing sentences and paragraphs. The syntax is how words fit together, otherwise known as grammar, form, etc. And you can see some examples down below. Now, I'm really intentional in this book and in my own practice to not get too wrapped up in the jargon. There's a reason that so many Americans, specifically, I'll say Americans, are afraid of grammar. And I think it's because of some of the grandstanding that linguists do. They will say, well, that's a coordinating conjunction, and they make people uncomfortable. So I think it's time that we just identify, how can we name a group of words, like connecting words or comparing words or counting words, right? If you don't know the term ordinal numbers, that's fine. You can still teach kids what count words are. And then the last one here is the discourse level. Some of this has come out of systemic functional linguistics or genre-informed pedagogy, looking at text types. So if I think about, I need to write a lab report. What kind of vocabulary do I need? What kind of mortar do I need in order to put this lab report together? And for students to be able to recognize the norms in particular text types. So you've heard me talk about norms, that's pragmatics. What would I expect to hear in a podcast, for example, or what would I expect to see in a persuasive essay? Those are the norms of a particular text type. And our content areas do tend to have text types that are expected of students. And there's a hidden curriculum there in teachers just saying, all right, everybody, record a podcast and bring it back next week, or, write a persuasive essay and bring it back next week. And so really highlighting the discourse level is breaking apart those text types or those genres so that students can recreate them successfully. All right, so I'm also going to introduce the terms noticing and forecasting. These are terms that, well, I made up to really just describe what is it that EL teachers do. I particularly wanted general education teachers to understand how can they respond to linguistic needs of their students. And so I say that it's in two ways. The first one is through noticing. So this is reflective in nature. So educators consider what they notice about their students' need for language development at the word, sentence, and discourse level. So I might notice that my student is, a really common one is that students start with the present progressive. So they say, teacher, I listening, teacher, I sleeping, I reading, right? And this is a really common part of language development. So if I notice that my student is starting with the present progressive, then what can I add to that? How can I teach them about the auxiliary verb that comes before that? Can I teach them about the simple present tense? How can I build upon what I'm already hearing? So it might be what you might consider an error. It might be an oversimplification. This is not just for English learners, by the way. My freshman year of college, I had red marks all over my first essay because I was using too many subject verb sentences. So it's just an opportunity to notice, hey, this is what you can do to level up your language skills. Then forecasting looks forward. Educators consider what language students will need in order to engage with and demonstrate mastery of the content. Educators can forecast in three ways. The first one is forecasting text. We also call this a text analysis. So take a look at the book or the article or the movie that students will be engaging with and make sure that you can break down that language ahead of time. Educators can forecast task. So what is it that students will be asked to do? Well, they're going to go on a field trip and then they have to, write a reflection on their experience there. Well, everybody in this room knows that they're going to need past tense verbs in order to do that, and probably some sequence language as well, right? So what do you anticipate they're going to need in order to carry out that task? And then the last one is test, and this one is twofold. So one is making sure that if I am attending to a particular language area in class, that I am assessing them on that language area. That gets overlooked quite a bit. And the other one is that I'm not inadvertently testing language when I intend to test content. And that can be a really tough one to suss out. All right, so we get a little bit snarky in this book, and this is an example of that. So you can see an example of a student email in all caps. Hey, John, I don't understand what I'm supposed to do for class tomorrow. What is the assignment? My sister's car broke down, so I missed class yesterday. Please tell me what I need to do. RN. Now, this is a kind of a compilation of some conversations that I have overheard myself as a professor and heard professors kind of grumbling when they get emails like this. So here's a list of responses from this curmudgeonly professor. The first is, hey, as for horses, whatever happened to more polite greetings? Where does he get off calling me John? This generation doesn't appreciate how hard it is to earn a terminal degree. It's Dr. Wilshire, thank you. He is definitely starting our relationship on the wrong foot by yelling at me in an email. I have this guy pegged. Has he even checked the syllabus or logged into the class site? He doesn't value my time. Why is he telling me about his sister's car? This is too much information to tell your college professor. What is RN? Registered nurse? Closing. Thank you. Best. This kid doesn't take me or my class seriously. I will be surprised if he passes. So I share this with you because we can create these warm spaces in school, but they're going to go into spaces that aren't necessarily as warm, right? And in this case, the professor is leaping to all sorts of conclusions about this student that aren't necessarily true. And how could that have been avoided? Well, maybe it couldn't have. Maybe students are going to continue using their own virtual jargon. But if we really focus on the genre of an email and what is expected in an email, and what does it mean if you're using all caps in an email, and what in a formal email might someone expect you to say or not say. All right, so I want to introduce the idea of practical applications of theory, and then Natalia is going to dive into one that is really, really exciting. The ones that Natalia has highlighted, I think, are really impactful. So what we're doing here is bridging theory and practice. The theory in this case is a set of principles on which a practice of an activity is based. So every time that we put what we're calling a PAT out there, a practical application of theory, which you can consider similar to a strategy or a way kind of to introduce a particular topic, that it's always based in theory. And in our case, based in theory from some important people in the field who have been doing a lot of this work.
All right, so some of the frameworks that we share in the book are tied to how can you use this in the classroom and trying to bring everything together. Community cultural wealth is something that Tara Yoso wrote quite a few years ago now. And oftentimes we go and we learn about these things as teachers and the professionals, and then we're left with, well, how do I teach this? How do I put this into practice into the classroom? What's the connection, right, between these ideas and what students should learn and figure out? And so community cultural wealth is one of these frameworks or theories that I actually love. And I love being able to understand community cultural wealth, not only from a perspective of, okay, this gives me a lens to understand my students and to value the things that they bring to the classroom. But if it made such a big difference to me, shouldn't our students also know about these things? Shouldn't they be able to understand themselves as well and their communities and be able to apply this to the reading, to the work that they're doing, to the writing, to the things that they're doing? And some of the things that we write in the book is how you can take something like this, for example, and teach it to your students, but then also make the connection so that the students are not just passive consumers of information, so that they can actually go and be producers of information, being able to take these things and make the connections between these theories, their personal life, and language of English. So the example today won't be about community cultural wealth, but this is just an example of something that you can take and that you can think and create about, well, how can I lift, right, the familial capital that my students are bringing to our school community? How can I lift the in our world, right, as English language teachers, linguistic capital is very just natural in our world, but also how can I foster navigational capital? How can I be intentional about my students understanding what it is and connecting with each other so that they can support and help each other? So those are some of the ideas that we have in the book. And so the example that I'm going to share today is with the theory of language orientations. And so Dr. Rees wrote about the dispositions that different people have regarding language and how it impacts multilingual speakers and communities. And so in general, like what I think through is, how can I teach the theories to the students first so that they have this critical understanding? And then how can I apply that theory with the students to whatever it is that we're learning about, and then looking at how can we evaluate our learning together and then sharing it with a larger community. So I'm going to share an example of that today. So this language orientations is divided into three big ideas. One is that sometimes people perceive language differences as a problem, right? And in a negative light, such as, well, we can't all get along if we all speak different languages, and that's a problem. We all need to just be able to do one language only, and therefore no other languages matter. So that's one of the orientations that are experienced in society. The second one is about language rights. And so understanding that people from diverse linguistic communities have different language rights, and that they can't be banned from accessing society because of their different language experiences. And then the last one is that language is a resource, right? So opposite to that first disposition, we can view language differences as a resource. How can we just foster that knowledge and community? And so that's one of the things that that I work with students. This is actually an academic paper. It's probably like a 30-page paper that was published in I can't remember what the paper was, the journal, but in the journal, right? And so to think that we can take like an academic paper and break it down to high schoolers or middle schoolers, that's a high task, right? However, these concepts are important for our students to understand. And you're going to see lots of language, right, in this. Assimilation, monolingualism, multilingualism. And so through this, we can already begin to apply that language of access. We have our Greek and Latin roots. What's mono versus multi? Like, how do we help our students connect these things? And so there's a lot of high, like, deep, complex language that students learn through learning some of these concepts. And then one way that I do that is through developing visual notes so that we don't have to try to break down like a whole academic paper. Let's use visual notes to get to the meat, the content, and the vocabulary that they need, and then we can go ahead and use it. And so the book will walk you on how to develop visual notes if that's something that you love. So we go through this, we understand the theory as a class. Students are able to take the notes visually, like this is a one-pager. I usually break it down because it's a lot of information to do in one sitting. But then we discuss, and students are able to use this to explain these concepts. So that's step number one, helping our students understand the theory. And so the next one is, then I try to find texts that support our work. And I try to find texts that are both mirrors and windows for our students. This is actually a book that we used with our 9th through 12th graders. They were in a multi-grade classroom. Intermediate level speakers of English, and it helped us both center Native American experiences, but because there's a lot of language issues that are brought up in the book, our students are able to make connections and also see themselves reflected in some of the practices and lived experiences that the Navajo speakers of the book live. And so it brings both of those things together. So after we found the text, then we dive into some text analysis. And so the book really has three big chunks, the Code Talker book. And the first one is the experiences of a Navajo boy that gets dropped off at the boarding schools. And then it talks about his upbringing, he joins the military, and then the last part of the book is how Navajo is used as a tool, right, to have a code in the Army. And so we're able to explore how language is perceived throughout the book. Like, is that different language, Navajo, being perceived as a problem because it's a different language, or is it being perceived as a resource? And you see how this changes depending on where it happens in the story of the book. But we try to use that analysis, right? So now we've learned about the language orientations. We have a critical framework that we can apply. We are reading a text, and now we're using that framework to analyze the text and be able to dive into that analysis piece of the text, and also being able to use connections. And students use this to explain their examples. And so as we do that, then our students are working through that language of access to navigate those pieces. So this is just an example of how they sort some of the quotes, and then they should be able to justify why they think that that quote is either an example of language as a resource or if language is a problem. And then we're using a lot of things that we need to work in school, right? Like, how do you find evidence? How do you prove your point? Like, how do you do quote integration? And a lot of the language of access piece that we're doing through this work. Oh, click outside the window, Michelle. There we go. And this is just another example of responding to the text. So responding to the text, we go both through analysis, but also through storytelling. And so some of the prompts that students had to do were related directly to the text, but they were able to connect their own lived experiences as responses to some of the writing that we were doing. And so that was the connection to identity. So again, we're working with identity, but we're also working with the language of access. Our students are developing narration in this example, for example. And then evaluation and sharing. So how do we evaluate this work? How do we know that our students know what they do? And then how do we share that? And so thinking of how do we collaborate with our students, right, for the feedback, like are they getting feedback along the way? Because we know that once and done at the end is not enough. And so how do we integrate that feedback throughout as a feedback loop throughout all of this work so that by the time we get to our final product, the students are proud of what they've learned and they can show us their learning. And then always thinking of who is the audience, right? Who are we writing for? And some of the things that I work with our students were to take the work that they did and to be able to compile it together to share back to their families and their communities. And so always thinking of who's the bigger audience that our students can share their work with. Okay, do you want to talk about the last part, Michelle?
Sure. So at the end of our book, we kind of wrap things up with a variety of tools. One of them is a classroom inventory on the language of identity and criticality, a classroom inventory on the language of access, and then a school-wide inventory. So these are some resources that you can use to kind of evaluate how are we doing? How are we doing as it relates to one area or another so that you can have a continuous cycle of improvement. All right, so that's all for now. We do have some time for questions. Thank you so much. And that's our names and our contact information. And I think,
Thanks.
Do we want to go Q&A or the winners?
Let's start with the Q&A if you don't mind. Thank you so much.
Okay.
I do have one question from the chat, and if anybody has anything that's coming up for them, feel free to put it in there so Michelle and Natalia can answer it. But the first one I have here is someone was asking, is there a link to learn more about the Jim Cummins and Nelson Flores debate?
Yes, and I think I would recommend going to Nelson Flores's blog. I can do a little bit of digging to see if I can find out what it's called, but he has a blog where he had a series of posts, and it was kind of 2020 or so that this conversation was amping up between the two of them.
But thank you. Yeah. And then if we don't get it during the webinar, we can try and link to it in the follow-up email as well.
Okay.
Next question. Someone says that they'll be teaching SIOP English for multilingual learners for the first time this year, court graduation class, all multilingual students. I have a district pacing guide curriculum and a PLT. Where do I start with applying the LILA concepts in this situation?
For me, it's taking a little bit of a
Natalia.
Yeah. So really thinking of what is it that students want to learn, right? Oftentimes we focus on the mechanics of language, and we know that the mechanics of language only go so far. Students may be able to recite, right, verb conjugations or even vocabulary words and the right and correct spelling. But that doesn't always mean that it's being transferred into practice. And so my question is always, well, what's the goal? What is the function that they're trying to learn, and how to apply this? And when we get to the function piece, right, that means we need to engage our students in relevant real life examples of either writing or speaking and those pieces. And so that's how you're able to connect the mechanics of language or some of those pieces that we are required to teach with the application piece. And so thinking of what's the bigger picture first, what is that product that you want your students to be able to deliver, and then attaching the mechanics of language that we need for those. And I think that embeds both of what Michelle was talking about regarding the language of access, but also the language of identity. Are the books that we're using the best for the product or the intention or the purpose that we need? And sometimes that's where I take a step back to look for a text that actually does what I want them to do. And so hopefully your district is supportive that you can do some of that text selection to find what is best for the students. And if not, always being able to connect. I pick this text because it applies and it helps me to meet that standard. And that's one way to be able to justify the choices that we make into the type of writing and the type type of text selection that we use. So I hope that answers your question, Nicholas.
Thank you, Natalia. I do have another question here, and if anybody has anything else, feel free to drop it in the chat there. How does the language of access expand our notion of academic language?
So I think that one
Either-
really comes down to, first of all, recognizing some of the inherent problems with the concept of academic language. I think that's important to just call out that, you know, if an association of Black linguists are saying, hey, these are some terms that have wounded our community members, then we need to listen. So that would be my very first response to that. And the second one would be that it expands upon the concept. So if we were to embrace this idea of there being school talk, which I reject, but if we were to embrace the idea of there being school talk, let's also recognize that there is language needed to access all sorts of different spaces, and that it's not just school. So I think it's just kind of expanding upon, you know, I need the language in order to get into med school. I need the language in order to understand my cancer diagnosis. I don't have one, but you understand what I mean. Like there's some really sophisticated language that comes into different spaces that we might not be prepared for.
Thank you. We had a couple more coming here too. How can this book in practice be used in tandem or support of language revitalization efforts, e.g. Hmong, Somali, Karen, when those efforts exist under world languages or something similar and less in multilingual learners?
That is such a good question, Sue. And I'm glad you answered that question because I do believe that the world language and the multilingual learners are both different sides of the same coin, right? We really cannot do one without the other. And oftentimes in the multilingual learning world, we only focus on the English piece. And so as we begin to use more translanguaging practices, we open that door to our students, both literacy, but also oral knowledge in their home languages. And so as we're able to say, well, let's brainstorm in, you know, whatever language you need, or let's do interviews and how do we facilitate you, right, those other languages being present in the class. I think that opens the door to collaboration with our world language colleagues. And I've seen, and I'm just going to do a shout out to one of my colleagues where I taught. She mostly served our newcomer population, but then she did a partnership with the Spanish teacher. And so our students were able to talk to each other, and right, our English speaking students would support our Spanish speaking students, and our Spanish speaking students would support our English speaking students that were learning Spanish. So that's just one example. But I also think of, in Minnesota, we have the bilingual SEALs, and we know that our districts don't always have the support for our students to sustain their languages. And so as we do work to build spaces where our Somali speakers and our Hmong speakers and our Korean speakers are able to develop their language skills, right, that ties to the world in multilingual learning, because the SEALs often go through that lens as well. And so how do we can collaborate more across departments, because sometimes we're siloed and we don't talk to each other, and yet we should be all working to embed these practices into our settings. And so that would be one idea, is just how do we talk to each other rather than living in separate departments. I don't know, Michelle, if you have anything to add.
Well, you're so good, Natalia, at this kind of systematic approach because of the work that you do. I was just going to share that I learned a new word that I think is really helpful in this context. When I was in Northern Ireland, I used the word language revitalization, and they caught me and they said, no, we call it language reclamation. And the reason for that is because it wasn't just lost and we're bringing it back, it was taken. And I think that's a really important concept to think about. And it's kind of that criticality bend that Natalia has brought into this book, so that, you know, we're bringing it back because there has been oppression, and that oppression continues to exist. So kind of calling that out. Anyways, I just wanted to share a new word that I learned across the pond that I hadn't heard before.
Thanks. We do have one other question from Chloe. She's asking do you have any resources for texts for other subjects than language areas? I teach junior high school science, and my curriculum includes Spanish reading guides, but are there other resources that I could integrate beyond just the textbook?
So I'll take this at the beginning, and then Natalia, you can follow it up. The first thing that I would say is that LILA is ideological, right? It's kind of like translanguaging in that it's a mindset, right? And so we want to create spaces where home language is validated and valued in school, and that is reading. So I love that you mentioned that, Chloe, that making sure that they have text in home language, but it's also speaking, writing, and listening. So thinking about how can they activate those different modalities using language. Sometimes it isn't that we need to buy more things or that we need to, seek out more resources. Sometimes it's just our own disposition in the classroom around, just thinking outside the box about maybe somebody's relative works in a particular area and they can come in and teach us about it and use some home language while they're doing it. So I just wanted to add that there is an element of finding resources, but on top of that, it's ideological.
For sure. And I think beyond just adding resources on different languages, I also think of science has such a just wonderful opportunity to have an impact, right, on how we apply it in different parts of society. And so how can we bring that criticality to the science when it comes of how does something impact different communities? And so when I think of, and whether it is allowing students to have a critical framework of the history of how things were discovered, right? I mean, a quick example is the DNA discovery, right, with Watson and Crick, but what was Rosalind Franklin's role? And can we talk about how gender bias played a role in that? And then what is the student's responsibility going forward as they apply some of those critical frameworks? So we can look at the history of science as well, but also how do we apply that moving forward and in our own context, right? What does that mean for students in their science class when they're learning about these things or injustices that have happened across the history of science, and how can we remediate some of those? So that's one thing that comes to mind. I think the other thing that comes to mind is thinking of the stories that are told through science, right? So if we're thinking of a specific phenomenon and how is that impacting, like who does it impact the most? Who is it hurting? Who does it benefit? And what is our ethical and moral responsibility when it comes to the application of what we're knowing? How can we use what we are learning today in class to impact my community in a positive lens? And so, yes, it's language, but it's also helping our students be critical of how they use the knowledge that they're obtaining to become change agents, to just make life better for everybody in their communities.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And thank you, Michelle and Natalia.
Thank you. It was
so much for
wonderful. We
having
really
us.
appreciate it.